All right, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to be talking about functional range conditioning, FRC. I'm going to give you just an honest critique of the FRC movement system because I'm really familiar with it. I've been certified in it for quite a few years, and I've done other components of the FRS system. This critique I'm going to do is only about functional range conditioning, though. So if you're not familiar with FRC, I would say the main goal of FRC is to improve your active range of motion. But let's see what the creator, Dre, says functional range conditioning is all about. So here we go. This is the creator and founder and one of the instructors of all the FRS seminars. The definition that they give on the website for functional range conditioning is mobility, development, articular strength, and neurological control. So basically what I said just sounds a lot fancier and a lot better than more active range of motion, but that's really what you're going to get from this component of the FRS system. Now you go about getting this mobility, development, articular strength, and neurological control a few different ways. So if you're not familiar with FRC, I'm going to kind of break down the components of it before we really get into the critique so you really understand the system. But before I do that, I just want to show you an example of kind of what is capable if you really do apply the FRC principles and are diligent and aggressive about it. So this is Hunter Cook. He is one of the main instructors for the functional range conditioning. He is a really awesome trainer. I mean, he's fantastic. He's a great guy too. I've done some privates with him. He works with all kinds of elite athletes. I mean, look at this shit that he's doing here. His heel is like on his belly button. This is nuts. I mean, this is absolutely nuts. He actually worked with the girl who just won the gold medal in hurdles at the Olympics. I mean, he works with some pretty high level athletes, and he is like just some sort of like mutant. I mean, look at this stuff that he can do. And I remember whenever he first introduced himself to us when he was our instructor, he like said he got into FRC because his ankles were always getting injured. He was rolling them and he wanted to have better ankle mobility. I mean, look at this. He's dislocating his shoulders on this. And so what he did is he's like, so I got really into it and now I don't have those issues. And so like he is like standing talking to us and then he just like rolls his feet all the way to the side, like ankles on the ground. And I'm like, oh, that looks painful. And he's like, see, look what I can do now when before this would have had me in weeks and weeks of pain. And then this fucking dude, he jumps in the air. So he's basically jumping off of his ankles from the ground. And then he doesn't even just land. He like slams his ankles into the ground in that position. And I'm just like, what kind of witchcraft is this? Like what dark magic is going on? And he's real quick to tell you that you don't need that level of mobility. You know, he doesn't need that level of mobility. I mean, some people do. He works with Cirque du Soleil people and they need insane levels, but it's just kind of an example of how far you can take the system. I'm not saying that should be really anybody's goal. The good thing about the FRC and FRR system is that you can tailor it to whatever your specific kind of programming and goals are. And this requires a lot of strength. You're not going to be able to do this if you're just all have like bendy passive range of motion. You got to be strong within that crazy range. Otherwise, it's useless. In fact, it can actually be very dangerous. All right, so real quick, let's go over the main techniques that FRC employs to improve your active range of motion. So one thing that they are really big on is what's called CARs. And this is an example of a hip CAR. And CAR just stands for controlled articulate rotation. And you're just trying to take your joint through the full expression of its range of motion. And they are very, very big on CARs and FRC. Anytime you see somebody in the gym and they're doing this little, they're doing some FRC CARs for their shoulder. And so this is what you would call a level 1 where he's not blocked or he's not weighted, but you can progress these as well. And from like an FRC lens, the purpose of this is to kind of control the range of motion that you have so you don't lose it, and also to kind of just upload new range of motion once you gain it. And here's an example of some different shoulder CARs from a guy, Movement by Matt, who I did a podcast with, and we dove pretty deep into the FRC system with the internal strength model as well. So if you're interested in learning more, check that out. And he's just showing us some shoulder CARs from some different angles. You know, the most traditional one is the one I show where you're just kind of like standing up, but you can bias different things depending on your base. And then finally, we have some spine CARs, and spine CARs might be my favorite. Here we have John Quint working with IFBB pro bodybuilder Seth Shaw, and this is really sped up. They're going through a spine CAR, and this, like I said, is probably my favorite one. I think it might give you the most benefit out of all of them. And they actually did a really cool podcast with Dre talking about the ISM model for a bodybuilder, which was really awesome because that's basically what I do, or I was doing at a certain point. So I'll link that at the bottom for you guys as well. Now, Who we have here, this guy right here, this is John Quint. So he's the neuromuscular therapist for Westside Barbell. I also did a podcast with John, so check that out if you want to learn more about the internal strength model as you apply it to bodybuilding. And he's actually the entire reason I got into the FRC system, because I had known about it since like, I don't know, maybe 2011. And then I heard him on a podcast like 2014, 15, talking about it, how he was implementing a lot of the principles with the athletes at Westside Barbell and bodybuilders like Justin Compton, who is my new coach, who I also just recently did a podcast with, if you want to check that out. And I was like, whoa, okay, this kind of piques my interest because he's working with fucking giant mutants and the strongest people in the world. Well, before I ever heard him or saw him, who was also, John Quint's a fucking massive beast too. He used to be a competitive bodybuilder as well. So before I heard him talking about it, it was all like bendy dudes with man buns pretty much that I had really seen practicing it. So then it started to appeal to me a little bit more. And if you don't know who the bodybuilder he's working with, Seth Shaw, this is who that is, and he is an overall winner of the North Americans. He's really the only IFBB pro that I know that was doing the FRS internal strength model and applying these principles. He's retired now. He did pretty good. I think he got 5th or 6th at the Chicago Pro one year, beat John De La Rosa. Really great physique, just didn't quite have the size to hang with the top pros. And on the podcast that he did with Dre and John, one of the things that he talked about was he really felt like the system and the spine cars in particular really helped him kind of prime his system before he worked out, but also helped him present his physique much more aesthetically and in a much better way on stage, because he had so much more access to different ranges of motion. Like, if you're doing a quarter turn, you want to try to get as much rotation to that judge from your upper half as you can. You got to keep your hips straight forward. So having that ability to really present more of it will give you a more impressive, wider look. All right, so the FRC system employs cars for everything: shoulders, knees, elbows, ankles, wrists, neck, spine. It is one of their main components. I would say one of the other 3 main components of the FRC system, along with cars, is pails rails. So this is the technique that FRC uses to really increase your range of motion. They claim that it expands capsular space. I don't really know if that is a true claim. For me, it's just kind of a variation of good old PNF stretching, which they get kind of mad if you say that. But the way it works is you get to an in-range position and then you hold a passive stretch for about 2 minutes. At the end of the 2 minutes, you activate what's called the progressive tissues. That's what the P stands for in pails. And so what that means is you're going to activate the tissues that are stretched. You're going to activate them slowly, and you're going to build up to like a maximum output, working as hard as you can. And then you immediately reverse and activate the regressive tissues, which is what the R stands for in rails. And so you just go to 100% right away on that. So let me show you some examples. So here we have my man Matt. He's trying to get some more internal rotation. So he's pushing down to the table as hard as he can. And now he's going to reverse that, and he's going to try to activate the regressive tissues and lift this up, even though he might not get up at all. You can see just a little bit. And after that, he should gain some internal rotation in that hip. Here's another example of some hip flexion. So same concept. He's just pushing down on the chair as hard as he can. And then he's going to basically try to lift up the knee at the end of that time. So it's basically a PNF stretch with a little bit of activation on the shortened tissues. So the other component of FRC training, we have cars, you have your pails rails. The other one is going to be your in-range training. And in the FRC system, you do this to kind of capture and utilize a new range of motion so that your body doesn't like just forget it right away, because it's brand new. You've never utilized it before. So they have a few techniques that they use to gain more control of this new range of motion. One of them is a passive range hold. So here we have Matt lifting up his back leg into internal rotation passively, and then he's just going to let go and hold that for 10, 15 seconds, whatever your duration is. And then this is another in-range move. This is called a hover. So he's lifting up at his in-range and he's moving through space on this one. Here's just a normal lift off. So he's starting at kind of his in-range of hip extension, and he's not passively lifting off, he's actively lifting up his knee into a hip extension, and then he's going into extension at the knee as well. All right, so like I said, those are the 3 components of FRC pretty much. The other thing that they incorporate in FRC are negatives, which they call eccentric neural grooving, which I think sounds cooler, but it's just an eccentric. And I do think that's one thing that the whole FRS system is a little guilty of, is trying to be a little bit more grandiose than it really is, a little more fancy than it really is. So the E and G would be like if he just held his foot up there for as long as he possibly could and let it down real slowly as he started to fail, and you'd be holding that for like a minute plus typically. Now that we kind of know a little bit more about the techniques that FRC uses and what its main purpose is, let's talk about who are good options to incorporate a lot of these FRC principles. Well, right off the bat, I can think of anyone that needs to use extreme range of motion, whether it's just in recreational activities like mountain climbers, or if you're an athlete like a power lifter, Olympic lifter, somebody in jiu-jitsu. It's real obvious to see where you would need to have good in-range control of your joint in a sport like jiu-jitsu, right? Say you're in a Kimura, you got your arm behind your back, deep in internal rotation. Well, if you don't have a good range of motion with active control, you could really get injured, but also if you've got good control in there, you've got more room to go before you have to really get worried. And then you also can fight it off long enough so maybe you can reverse the position, get out of the round. So obviously with a sport like jiu-jitsu, you can see where a system like this would be great, and it is really big with a lot of BJJ people. In fact, they're one of the biggest populations of people who use this. Like I said, John Quint implements this system with all the powerlifters at Westside Barbell, and that's the thing with a place like Westside Barbell, results speak for themselves. They're not going to fuck around and do all this like pails, rails, and bullshit and take away from the volume they're doing unless they're seeing positive results. And the strongest people in the world, often come out of Westside Barbell. Athletes are just people who are doing really repetitive motions under force, especially if it's like asymmetrical. That is someone who would really benefit from the FRC system. Talking about like golfers, right? They have to really be able to maintain that ability to rotate the trunk to get a good swing, but also to make sure they don't get injured. And they're doing that over and over again. So implementing some of the cars, load it where you really need it, kind of isolating the range of motion that you need, like that's really beneficial. So it's a really good way to build up resilience to patterns that you have to repeat with a lot of force. Like I said, Hunter was training the girl who just won the gold medal. That is a very asymmetrical sport. The hurdles, you have one leg kind of going up one way and the other flying around the side into more of like external rotation. So you have to program for that. So when you need really specific things for your activity, the FRC system is like a great tool. Also, the FRC along with the ISM system are really good with rehab, whether it's still pretty early stages of rehab or it's late stages and returning to activity. It's a really good tool to help kind of get that awareness that you lost, because when you have an injury, you really like lose awareness of what's going on with that injured body part, because your mechanoreceptors, they're just kind of offline. And then doing these rotational works and these isometrics can really help wake those up. So you have mechanoreceptors in your joints that give you instant feedback to like the world around you. So if those aren't doing very well and they're not functioning, you get a delayed response and your body doesn't really know how to handle forces. So if you have an acute injury, FRC is really good. Now, if you're experiencing acute discomfort, I would say that's a little bit different. FRC is really helpful for acute injuries, a lot of times traumatic injuries to like tissues, whereas if you have like something that just started tweaking a little bit, FRC, it might help, but there might be other options that could be more effective. And then one more population that would really benefit from doing some FRC work are people that are hypermobile. So like I talked about, FRC is all about gaining active range of motion. So these people that are just super floppy, FRC is really great. They're not trying to do pails rails to gain more range of motion, but they're doing positional isometrics and positional pails rails to gain control of what they've already got. All right, so who might FRC not be the most optimal for? And remember, there's really like no way it's like wrong, because you can use whatever part of it you want and apply it in any way. So I'm just talking about like people that might not want to be doing tons of cars, tons of in-range training, particularly and like all day pails rails. So one group of people that will not benefit that much from FRC are bodybuilders. Now, there are definitely components you can take from it that you will benefit from. Okay, I'm talking about some of the joint work, some of the capsular work, especially like priming your system, doing some in-range pails contractions, and that can actually increase PAP, post-activation potentiation, so you're stronger during your actual workout. But I don't think you have to be obsessive about doing pails rails, and I think there's better ways to gain range of motion as a bodybuilder than trying to isolate very specific areas like that. And I think cars are kind of silly in general, especially as a bodybuilder. You're not really getting anything out of that. And in-range training, it's really not going to give you any hypertrophy benefits. And this stuff takes away from your volume that will. And this happened to me when I got my ISM cert. I really love ISM. And I started kind of really diving in deep. And That's a lot of shit doing all this stuff, and especially once you start doing all the stuff that the ISM inputs, it takes a lot of time. I was doing 45 minutes of this before I started my workout, and so I lost a lot of volume, and I feel like I suffered on gaining a little bit of size. Now, there are periods where you might want to implement a lot of the FRC principles, maybe like a deload. That's totally different. That's awesome. You're going to cut away volume anyway. Don't just like stop doing volume and then just spend all this extra time doing nothing. Use that time to do joint specific work. But when you're trying to grow during like a push, I don't think you would benefit from doing tons of the FRC techniques. Another population that I think don't get tremendous benefit from FRC is the elderly. And I probably get a lot of pushback on this from different FRC practitioners, but the elderly had been my specialization, elderly and disabled, up until like 6-7 years ago. It was all I worked with, where everybody I worked with was over 70. And I found that as you get older, your tissues, they're just shit. They're just really shitty. There's a huge difference between like any manual therapist will know it if you felt it, like between young supple tissues that feel good and then just these old shitty kind of leathery tissues. And I do think, again, I don't think there's really ever a negative between getting a little bit of capsular awareness. So I really do like, especially for the shoulders and hips, just a little bit of work in those in ranges, maybe not necessarily applying pails rails, but for the elderly people, we really need to take into account other things besides what FRC provides. We need to think about propulsion. We need to think about their axial skeleton position. They're going to get a lot more increases in range of motion if we can improve their ribcage and pelvis dynamics. And then we need to worry about strength. A lot of times with elderly people, their tissues are like so shitty that doing like a little pails rails is only going to give you a little bit of range of motion, and it's hard for them to produce the amount of force that requires to actually make a substantial change. And they're not going to benefit from doing some cars all kind of shitty and orienting all around with it. And they definitely don't need to do in-range training, so they need to get stronger. They need to put force on their tissues, and that's actually going to improve their mobility way more than, like I said, doing some of the techniques that FRC offers. I mean, at the end of the day, strength matters most. And I also think just healthy beginners who are just going to the gym 2 or 3 times a week that don't have any injuries, aren't like so immobile that they're just dealing with all kinds of issues on the regular, I don't think they need to waste a lot of the time that they have doing cars and in-range training and stuff like that. If you don't have issues like mobility-wise and you don't need more mobility and you work out like appropriately with a good stack and keep intention where it should, you'll maintain or even improve your mobility. You don't have to do a lot of outside stuff, especially like I said, if you're only coming to the gym a couple times a week. And that's you and you're only in the gym a couple hours a week. You can gain the same amount of shoulder flexion doing a pullover, just a negative, maybe hang out in the in range or go really slow in the negative or hold the in range. I guarantee you, if you check your shoulder flexion after that, it'll probably be just the same, if not better, than doing 2 minutes of a pails rails and not really getting a lot of stimulating work to your muscles. All right, so let's talk about some of the shortcomings of FRC. So in my opinion, the main issue that FRC has is that it is like really reductionist. And I mean that in a lot of different ways. So I guess probably the biggest way I say it's reductionist is the fact that it doesn't take into account the axial skeleton like at all. I mean, I could do a couple repositioning drills and get the ribcage and the pelvis to line up better, and then I can gain tons of range of motion in my shoulders, my hips, and everything all at once. Whereas like FRC, you're going to kind of break down and do things individually when a lot of times muscles are tight because they're concentrically oriented because of the position of your pelvis and ribcage, because of your shape. And you can stretch that all you want and you'll get a little bit of relief, but it's going to go right back. It's not going to stay that way because your body is doing that for a reason. It has to do that. And so you can get a lot more range of motion typically by getting a shape change. And then after that, if you want to do all the pails rails you want, then go for it. You're on a way better foundation. So for example, let's say I am missing a lot of left shoulder abduction, my pec's tight, which is often the case if you have any left AIC traits. So if I'm looking at this through a FRC lens only, I'm going to be pails railing that, trying to get that to open, trying to expand capsular space. And you might get a little bit, but probably not that much because likely the restriction is a bony blockage. You're not going to be able to stretch through bone. So if you are presenting with a pretty big AIC brachial chain pattern, your sternum is going to be turned to the right a little bit, and that is going to kind of limit the room that your humeral has to work with that glenoid fossa. It's going to hit bone on bone. And so if I do a couple drills that kind of reposition my rib cage, well, now I've got a ton of range of motion and it's not going to go back right away. It'll stick there a little bit longer. Another good example is the hip flexors. I mean, people that practice FRC are doing tons of hip extension, pels, rails, and that's not a terrible thing. But if your pelvis isn't aligned, it's gonna create issues, right? So, right, let's say I'm anteriorly tipped, these femurs are a little shortened. I can stretch this all I want, but I'm not doing anything to get rid of the compression that's keeping me forward. So eventually they're gonna tighten right back up. What I need to do is get this guy to just pull back, and now these are just lengthened and they're in a more like natural lengthened resting position. They're not short, they're not having to orient my pelvis to get me to move through space. I can kind of just chill. And so you would do that by like doing that 90-90 on the wall. That's a really good way to turn off your hip flexors. And if you've seen any of my videos, you see me do that a ton of times. Another example of how it's kind of reductionist and doesn't take the axial skeleton into account is like how much relative motion are we using and how much orientation are we using to gain that range of motion. So what I mean is I could be doing like a pels rails to try to gain extra rotation in my shoulder. And again, if I have any brachial chain pattern problems, I'm going to be pretty compressed in the upper left back. So I might, once I get close to in range, have no option but kind of go there. And if you're not hyper aware, now I'm kind of just reinforcing bad movement patterns. Well, typically, again, it's really specific. Someone who might want some orientation would be like a left-handed pitcher. And you need to orient a little bit to get that big wind up, well then you would want to include that a little bit. But most general people, they're going to want to be aware and just keep it more on the actual joint tissue itself. So it's really easy to kind of slip up and try to really get that extra range of motion and then start getting other things involved and take the tension off the target tissue. A lot like whenever you use excessive range of motion when you're working out and you start to orient, you take tension off the target tissue. For example, I had a guy who I was trying to gain some internal rotation with. We were doing a kneeling pels rails, and I have him down, we do the whole thing, and then I throw him on the table, I'm all excited to check, I bet it's gonna be better. It was fucking worse. You know, it looked like he had more internal rotation just kind of based off the positioning, but he was kind of twisting and his axial skeleton was getting in a worse position, and he lost range of motion. He gained more orientation that was like fake internal rotation, but he lost true internal rotation. So it's actually really easy to kind of go overboard and not only not improve mobility, but potentially make it worse. Now I will say, like, all the best practitioners are pretty aware of this, and you know they're intuitive enough if they aren't aware of. But there's a lot of people that are new to FRC, and I see a lot of people kind of really going about it in ways that I would say probably not the most optimal. Let's talk about another example, one more of how important the exoskeleton position is. So if you follow any FRC people online, you'll see that they absolutely jizz themselves over tibial rotation. I mean, it is like their favorite thing. You can go through any of their IGs and just scroll down just a little bit and you'll find something. And I'm not making fun of them. These are all people that I think are good trainers and I know, but it is kind of funny how it's like so prominent in the FRC world and I think it's a good thing, especially for like acute injury, but I do think a lot of people like kind of overestimate the impact they're going to have because they're not thinking about the relationship between the pelvis and the foot. Because to be honest, the knee is a pretty like dumb joint. What I mean by that is it doesn't really create a lot of issues on its own. It's impacted by what's proximal and what's distal to it, typically the foot and the hip. So a lot of people try to address their knee issues by going directly to the knee joint when really they need to be looking somewhere else. So this is an example of someone who's got a really ER'd tibia. I mean, they both are, but this right one is even worse. And if you're looking at this through an FRC lens, you're gonna try to gain tibial rotation. You're gonna do pels rails for that. You're gonna do cars for that. You're gonna load and do negatives for that. And those are all well and good, but you're not going to have any impact on here if we aren't able to improve what's happening with this whole system. So anytime you see a tibia that's really externally rotated like that, that's your body's way of trying to find internal rotation to put force into the ground to move forward in space. And so you can see this guy's femur is a little bit more internally rotated, and so the tibia has to account for that excessive internal rotation by turning out so you can actually push off the ground with your foot. You're never going to improve this knee issue if you don't gain internal rotation as a whole. Now there's a number of reasons why you could get this externally rotated tibia. It can happen on both sides. If that happens on the right, it's often because you're just so turned that way that your femur is like over internally rotated, so your tibia has to account for that. If it happens on the left, usually because you start to like tip so far forward that this has to externally rotate out, that the tibia has to rotate in. So it can happen on either side, but it's the same issue. It's trying to figure out how to produce internal rotation. So let me give you an example for myself. So yesterday I was doing a kettlebell workout for this app I've been working on forever, and I haven't done kettlebells in a while, and my left knee got just a little bit tweaky. You know, nothing bad, but it wasn't an acute injury, it was acute discomfort. Now, the old me, because I did FRC before I really got into PRI and I really got into Bill Hartman's model. So the old me looking at it through a FRC lens would just go right to the knee, try some tibial rotation, do all the stuff I talked about already. Now, knowing what I knew it's because I was missing external rotation. I knew it was because my left side of my pelvis was kind of dumped forward. And so all I did was this posterior capsule inhibition to get my femur back a little bit and reorient my pelvis. And in this, I'm just driving back, trying to push this left knee back as I'm kind of pushing the right knee forward. I'm very heavy on those inner feet contacts, super important, the inner heel and that first med head right here. And I'm just really trying to see if I can get this upper adductor to fire. And it started hurting really bad when I really locked into it. And so just doing that kind of reoriented my pelvis enough that my femur didn't have to kind of be in a funky position. And then my knee was immediately better. And I didn't have to do anything to the knee at all. I didn't have to do anything else. So again, if you do a lot of stuff directly to the knee when you have like a little discomfort, you might get a little relief. And you could change the fluid dynamics. You could do a couple things that make you feel slightly better. But after this, I felt nothing, and it took 30 seconds. So this is why it's so important to have different viewpoints and know all these different systems, because you can pick out the best parts of them and then blend them together. Because I still use a lot of FRC stuff. I like it, but I like it a lot more once my axial skeleton is set like it's supposed to be and I have a lot more available range of motion to work with. I mean, one of FRC's strengths in a way is that it kind of breaks down everything to the individual component, because you can utilize that. Like say you're trying to get a better range of motion on something like a Jefferson deadlift. I talked about this with Atlas on the podcast that we did. You can break down the movements of that, and using the FRC model, you can get through sticking points. But like I said, breaking it down to the individual components also has a lot of drawbacks. It's going to take a lot longer to get improvements in measurements. Where I'm going to show you something that I did to really improve internal rotation on my entire left side. So this was actually right after I did that post-capsule inhibition I just showed you. I had my front foot elevated, and I'm just really focusing on feeling those foot contacts, and I'm trying to take myself through the beginning of the propulsive gait cycle to about the middle. And so I'm really focusing on feeling my heel, even more my outer heel as I'm back. And as I come forward, it goes more to the inner heel and to that first med head. After doing this and really being super careful about feeling those foot contacts and making sure everything's lined up, I'm turning to this left side, I'm getting a little IR there. I got tons of improvements in dorsiflexion and tibial rotation both ways, and internal rotation of the hip. I got a big bang for my buck right there by actually loading my tissues and utilizing the gait cycle and getting my whole body to work synergistically to get improvements across the board. 30, 40 seconds. And it would have took me 20 minutes to break down all that individually. So this kind of leads into another shortcoming that I think FRC has, in that it doesn't take into account any kind of locomotion or propulsion at all. And I think that's super critical to get changes that stick and that are really usable by your body. So this can be as simple as like using foot contacts in certain positions. Like 90-90 is a really common base position for a lot of stuff in FRC. And I think that's kind of silly. I don't think that's the best position. I don't think it's really translating a ton to real world. Like most everything that I do that's kind of like mobility related, I'm trying to make sure that I have foot contacts, whether it's on the ground or against the wall, something that will translate to me standing and having to produce force against gravity in a propulsive gait cycle. Here's an example of how I improved my cars dramatically by just kind of getting my ribcage to externally rotate. So again, you got to like look at it from a bigger view than just FRC. So on here, I got a kind of a sticky spot as I get to that in range of flexion, and I'm trying to get into some internal rotation. So if you understand the dynamics between your ribcage and your shoulder, you know that if you don't get external rotation in your ribcage, you're not going to get your scapula posteriorly tip and be able to get that in range of flexion and kind of transition from external rotation to internal rotation. So instead of just beating down pails, rails, and negatives and all that stuff, I am doing an inhibition technique that took 30, 45 seconds or so, and it immediately cleaned up my cars like dramatically, and it was much less crunchy going on. So my before was pretty bad, and then my after is much smoother. Take a look. So here's my after. It's much less further out to the side, and it is way smoother feeling to me. So that's the after. Let's look at the before one more time. So pay attention how close that stays to my side compared to the other one, and also the amount of rotation I'm having is much less than I had here. Way wider. So I was just missing a ton, and it was from the ribs. It wasn't because my shoulder joint. Again, it was because of the impact my axial skeleton was having on my appendages. Now, when I'm looking at the actual techniques that they use in FRC, cars, I think, are dramatically overrated for just about everyone. I mean, I think people spend so much time on them. I mean, the whole FRC system kind of takes a lot of time if you're really diving in. And it's easy to kind of get like almost OCD about it too. So I have this girl that I train, and she came to me after working with an FRC guy who was like all about it. It was like all they did, all the cars for everything, the pails, rails, the lift offs, and then they do like 1 or 2 external movements. So she's coming to me and saying she wants to do a lot of the FRC stuff. I'm like, okay. And she's expecting to spend like 30 minutes doing all of it on our first session. And then we go into the workout. She's like, oh, that's it. I'm like, yeah, we did like a 10, 15 minutes of it. You told me your goal was to get an ass. You ain't gonna build a fucking ass doing cars and tibia internal rotation on, okay? Like, let's get to work. And now she has an ass. Now, I do think cars can be beneficial for like the disassociative purpose. Not really shoulder cars. I'm not the biggest fan of that just because there's so much going on. There's a lot of orientation pattern. It's really hard to keep that relative. I like axial cars if I was going to do that, and that's just going through the rotation component. I really do like the hip cars that I showed you earlier, and he did them really good. Like, I think this is really beneficial to help make sure your back doesn't take over on movements. You know, if you've got hips that do their job, your back will feel better. And he's doing a really good job of being strict. But a lot of times I see people doing this move and they look like a corgi with their ass moving around every single time they move their leg. And that's not good. You're just reinforcing bad patterns, kind of like orientation patterns. Like I said, I really like the back one as well. For the same reason, you're going to get your back to operate without getting your hips involved. And again, that'll really build up some resilience and mobility. But overall, I think cars are really overutilized and overrated in the FRC system. Pails rails, I showed you that there's a lot of ways to improve mobility. Pails rails is just one of them. I think FRC places too much emphasis on that as well. What I think is more beneficial about the pails rails and like the mobility you gain is just kind of getting that capsular tissue fired up and waking up those mechanoreceptors. Like I said, you can increase PAP. And a lot of times, like if you do these joint specific work before you actually go into your workout, your warm-up weights still feel like nothing. You feel so much stronger right away just because you really kind of lit up your neurological system. In-range training, I think, is kind of silly if you don't need it for a specific activity. And I see like somebody sitting there doing like a lift off from 90-90. I really don't see a lot of real world benefit to that. I think when you train your body through a full range of motion loaded, you're going to get a lot more benefits when you think about the influence your axial skeleton has on your range of motion. You're getting a lot more benefits if you address it that way. I think manual therapy will give you a lot more benefits. So I don't think pails rails are bad, but I think you want to implement them after you've already addressed the position of your rib cage and pelvis. You know, really, there's a lot of ways to gain range of motion besides just doing the pails rails, and ways that may be more applicable to what you're about to do. So, for example, I can get a really big improvement in internal rotation if I do a move where I load my body through internal rotation. And so here I'm using a roller against the wall, and I'm in this kickstand deadlift position. And I'm really making sure that I'm heavy on that inner foot, again, to make sure I'm driving IR. I want to feel that medial hamstring and that inner thigh a little bit. And doing this is going to give me a lot better internal rotation on the table. It's also going to kind of like prep me in a lot better way for my heavy deadlifts I'm about to do than if I were to just kind of be doing a 90-90 pails rails internal rotation. So another way I could gain some active external rotation would be to do something like the DNS star. This is Abby Peligot, I think, on Instagram. So this is a DNS star. And again, this is an active way to drive range of motion. You're going to get better ER measurements after you do this. And again, this could be potentially more beneficial for the work you're about to do than just sitting there pushing your foot into the ground. So overall, I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to shit on FRC. I like FRC a lot. I just think that there are some shortcomings when you try to use it like by itself. And I wouldn't critique it like that much at all if it didn't view itself as this one-stop shop that does everything. Check it out. What is assess, program, improve, repeat. A complete system for athlete care and performance improvement. When you don't take the things into account that I talked about, I don't think it can be a complete system. But I do think it's a really good system, and I think it works really well with others. I just think you need to be strategic the way you implement it, and I think it's much more beneficial to certain populations than others. Now, in the future, I'd like to do a video on the ISM model, which I'm a much bigger fan of. That's really the only reason I did FRC was so I could get into the ISM, and I do think that it has a lot more cool applications than just basic FRC, and maybe more applicable to bodybuilders as well. All right, so that's all I got. Appreciate it. If there's any kind of like movement system or training system that you would like me to critique, just put it in the comments and I'll check it out. All right, thanks.